What would you do if you saw a man's faith break in a single shattering moment? What would you think if you watched a fighter, a man whose hands were his whole life, use them to strike a priest at the foot of a holy statue? The sound was a wet crack in the cold November air, a sound that did not belong in a place of peace. Beneath the unblinking eyes of the Virgin Mary, carved from pale marble, a man of God crumpled to the stone path, and the rogue fighter simply stood there, his chest heaving under a thin leather jacket. His name was Leo. He was a fighter, but the octagon lights of sanctioned bouts were a distant memory. Now his ring was the quiet desperation of Buffalo's East Side, a life measured in the worn-down heels of his work boots and the collection notices stuffed in his mailbox. His third-floor apartment in the Broadway Fillmore neighborhood smelled of stale coffee and regret, the windows looking out onto a landscape of brick and tired asphalt. The heavy bag hanging from a steel beam in the corner was his only confidant, its hide scarred with the ghosts of 1,000 combinations. Leo's hands, wrapped in stained tape, were a roadmap of his life. The knuckles were flattened, the skin a patchwork of pale scars from fights won and lost, both in and out of the ring. He once believed in them, in the power they held to change his circumstances, to protect what he loved. He trained them, honed them, trusted them to be the only answer he ever needed. But strength, he learned, had its limits. It was a currency that could not buy more time or bargain with a diagnosis. The fluorescent lights of Mercy Hospital of Buffalo had bleached all the color from the world. He remembered the incessant rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, a sound that became the ticking clock of his mother's final days. He had sat by her bed, his powerful hands resting uselessly on the starched white sheets, unable to stop the tremor in her own. He had watched her faith, once a force as solid as the foundations of the old churches in their neighborhood, become a fragile, questioning thing. Father Mark, the parish priest from St. Stanislaus, had come to her room. He spoke in soft, measured tones about God's plan and a peace that passes all understanding. To Leo, the words were hollow, an insult to the raw, physical reality of her suffering. He had wanted the priest to rage, to demand an answer from the heavens, to show some sign that he understood the injustice of it all. Instead, he offered pamphlets and quiet prayers, a spiritual balm for a wound that was gaping and physical. When his mother whispered her last faint word, it was a question, not a comfort. That was the memory that coiled in Leo's gut, a serpent of cold stillness. He left the hospital that day feeling the weight of his own strength as a profound and terrible failure. The catalyst came on a Tuesday afternoon, under a sky the color of lead, 2:14 p.m. Leo saw Father Mark walking through the grotto at St. Stanislaus Bishop and Martyr Church in Buffalo, New York. The priest was adjusting a small bouquet of wilting flowers at the base of the life-sized marble Virgin Mary, her face a mask of serene sorrow. The statue was old, brought over by Polish immigrants a century ago, her stone hands clasped in perpetual prayer. Leo's footsteps on the gravel were loud, each one a deliberate, heavy beat. He didn't say a word. He walked directly up to the priest, whose back was turned. An elderly woman kneeling at a nearby bench, her rosary beads clicking through her fingers, looked up. Father Mark turned, a mild question forming on his face as he recognized the young man from the hospital room months ago. There was no time for him to speak. Leo's right hand, the one he'd called his hammer, shot out. The punch was short, brutal, and perfectly thrown, connecting with a sound that made the old woman gasp and drop her rosary. The plastic beads scattered across the flagstones with a series of tiny, sharp clicks. Father Mark fell backward, his head striking the stone base of the statue before he slumped to the ground, a dark line of red beginning to seep from his lip. Leo stood over him, breathing hard, his knuckles already swelling. He looked from the fallen priest to the marble face of the Virgin, her expression unchanged. Leo turned and walked away. He did not run. He walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had just set fire to his own world and was waiting to watch it burn. The old woman was frozen, her hand covering her mouth. A groundskeeper paused his lawnmower a block away on Townsend Street, the sudden silence accentuating the sharp cry that finally escaped her lips. Leo didn't look back. He walked the dozen blocks to a small diner on Broadway, the bell over the door jingling his arrival. He slid into a booth, the red vinyl cracked and cold. He could feel the eyes on him, the whispers that started like rustling leaves and grew into a low murmur. A few tables away, he saw the old woman from the church, her hands trembling as she recounted the story to two other patrons. They looked over at him, not with accusation, but with a kind of fearful wonder. He ordered black coffee and stared into the cup. The heat did nothing to warm the chill that had settled deep in his bones. The waitress, a girl he'd known since high school, set the mug down without a word and backed away, her movements careful and wide. He was an island now, a toxic shore no one dared approach. He drank the bitter coffee, paid with crumpled bills, and walked back out into the cold, the shunning of his own neighborhood a physical weight on his shoulders. That night, sleep was a foreign country. A tremor started in his right hand, the one he had used to strike the priest. It wasn't violent, just a constant unnerving flutter, as if the muscles themselves were trying to shake off the memory of the impact. He tried to wrap it, to clench it into a fist, but the shaking persisted, a physical manifestation of a fault line that had cracked open inside him. The cold from the drafty window of his Broadway Fillmore apartment seemed to bypass his skin and settle directly into his marrow. He felt a tightness in his chest, a pressure that had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with the space the priest had occupied on the ground. At 3 a.m., he stood and began to pace the small room, the floorboards groaning under his weight. His own strength, the one thing he had always been able to rely on, was betraying him. His hands, the instruments of his trade and his sin, were no longer his to command. He was trapped in the cage of his own body, a prisoner of an act that replayed itself behind his eyes with every beat of his heart. He didn't know why he went back. Sometime in the deepest hour of the following night, his feet carried him through the silent streets, back to the grotto at St. Stanislaus. The church was dark, but the city's ambient glow cast a soft gray light on the scene. He stood where the priest had fallen, the space now empty, clean. He looked up at the marble face of the Virgin Mary, expecting to feel the same cold anger, the same void. Instead, a profound silence fell. The distant hum of traffic on the Kensington Expressway faded away. The rustle of dry leaves in the wind ceased. It was a stillness so complete it felt like a pressure against his eardrums. Then a scent filled the air, rich and impossible, the smell of fresh roses blooming in the dead of a Buffalo November. He looked around, seeing only the bare skeletal branches of the church's rose bushes. A soft, pale light began to emanate from the statue itself. It wasn't a glare. It was a gentle luminescence, as if the moon had been captured inside the stone and was now pouring out. It warmed his face, chasing away the deep chill in his bones. Across the street, a man smoking on his porch on Townsend Street saw the unearthly glow in the churchyard and stamped out his cigarette, his eyes wide. At that moment, a single clear bell toll rang out from the church tower, a deep, resonant tone that hung in the silent air long after it should have faded. The light receded as slowly as it had appeared, the silence gave way to the city's normal hum, and the scent of roses vanished. Leo stood there for a long time, the tremor in his hand finally still. He felt no booming voice from heaven, no sudden absolution. He just felt quiet. The knot of rage in his chest had not vanished, but it had loosened, its coils giving way to something else, something he didn't have a name for. He returned the next afternoon. The grotto was empty, the world back to its normal shades of gray and brown. He noticed a smear of mud on the stone pedestal at the Virgin's feet, likely from the groundskeeper's boots. It was a small thing, an imperfection. Without thinking, Leo knelt down on the cold flagstones, the first time his knees had bent for anything other than a fighter's stance in years. He used the sleeve of his worn leather jacket to wipe the mud away, his movements slow and careful. The gesture was small, almost meaningless, yet it felt heavier than any weight he had ever lifted. He stood, his knees aching slightly, and looked at the clean stone. On his way home, he stopped at a corner bodega and bought a single red carnation for $2. He walked back to the church, placed the solitary flower at the base of the statue, and left without looking back. The old woman who had witnessed the attack saw him from her window. She watched him kneel, watched him wipe the stone clean. The next morning, when Leo returned to the grotto, he found a steaming paper cup of coffee and a small pastry sitting on the bench, left there by an unseen hand. He drank the coffee, its warmth spreading through him. A quiet communion. A few days later, a group of teenagers who often loitered near the church, leaving behind empty chip bags and soda cans, saw Leo sweeping fallen leaves from the path. They watched him for a long time. The next day, one of the kids, without a word to his friends, walked over and picked up a discarded newspaper, placing it in a nearby trash can. It was a start. From the rectory window, Father Mark, his lips still swollen and stitched, watched the quiet man tending to the grotto. At Mass that Sunday, he stood before his congregation at St. Stanislaus, the bruise on his cheek a faded yellow. He asked them not for condemnation, but for compassion. He told them to pray for the troubled soul who had struck him, a man whose pain must be a burden too great to carry alone. Leo never spoke of what happened that night. He didn't need to. His new mission was a silent one, written in physical acts. He became the unofficial caretaker of the grotto, a quiet presence in the churchyard. He swept the leaves, pulled the weeds, and made sure the stone of the Virgin Mary was always clean, always honored. His hands, which had once been weapons of destruction, were now instruments of simple, devoted care. The tremor never returned. The neighborhood began to see him not as the monster who had attacked their priest, but as the quiet man who tended the garden. A young mother, walking with her son, once pointed to Leo and whispered, "He watches over her." The boy asked if he was a guard. "No," she replied after a moment's thought. "He's a gardener. He helps things grow again." Leo found his penance not in whispered confessions, but in the scrape of a shovel, the pull of a weed, and the silent company of a statue made of stone. The most profound strength is not the power to break things, but the courage to mend them. Leo's journey wasn't about a miraculous conversion that wiped the slate clean, but about the quiet daily work of making amends, one small act at a time. Grace doesn't always arrive like a lightning bolt. Sometimes it comes like a cup of coffee left on a bench, or the choice to pick up a piece of trash instead of walking by. If this story touched you, like the video, subscribe to and share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us your moment of unexpected grace in the comments.